In this video, I will demonstrate how to measure, cut, and install shade tube. I do recommend using the same tape measure that you measure your bracket to bracket with to cut the tube, just in case there's any variances in the two tape measures. And a wide tape measure is going to be best for getting longer shades. Here we're going to measure for an idle to idle and then a drive to idle. So we'll have a motor, a female, a male, and an idler. With a coupled bracket, I'd stand at the coupled bracket and I'd measure both sides. That way I don't have to move my ladder. Measuring from this side is difficult. It's doable, but you can see I've got this bent tube. It's just awful to try and make this measurement work. Measuring points on a coupled shade. The idler bracket has a bump out. That bump out is to mimic the motor. When you're measuring an idle side, you want to measure from the face of the bump out, not the base, but the face. Measuring the motor side, I'm measuring from the face of my motor side or drive side bracket to the face of the coupling bracket. I measure from the idle face to the coupler face, and I've got 30 and 13/16. And then on the drive side, we'll measure from the drive face to the coupler face, and I've got 31 and 1/4. Now we need to do our deductions. So the way that the deductions work is pretty simple. All of the idlers across the board is a deduction of 1/4 inch. And that deduction is basically your overall tube width. So when measuring from bracket to bracket, that tube width minus 1/4 inch. All of the motors across the board are going to be a deduction of 1/2 inch. So here I've got a motor and an idler. So it's going to be 1/2 inch plus 1/4 inch, and then the credit card, the most important part. So 1/4 plus 1/2 is 3/4, and then the credit card is an added 16th, so it's 13/16 will be our deduction. On the opposing side, I have two idlers. I've got my male idler and I've got my 10mm idler. So it's 1/4 inch plus 1/4 inch. Now every single tube gets an extra 16th, not just drive side, every single tube. So the credit card on this one will go from 1/4, 1/2, 9/16. So a deduction of 9/16 on this side. So I realize that most people haven't done fractional math since high school or even before that. There's apps you can download, super simple. I'm gonna go ahead and plug in the first measurement and just see what it says. Let's go ahead and take our first deduction here, which was 30 and 13/16, minus an idler, minus a credit card, 9/16. So 30 and 13/16 minus 9/16 equals 30 1/4. So we're going to cut this tube at 30 1/4 and then fit it and make sure that the credit card actually goes all the way down to the nylon surface. Now on this side, we've got a motor and an idler, so that's 1/2 inch plus 1/4 inch plus our credit card, which is a 16th. So this is all 13/16. So we've got 31 and 1/4 minus 13/16 equals 30 and 7/16. So I'm going to take both of these numbers out to my chop saw and cut them, come back in, dry fit them, and make sure that my credit card reaches all the way down to the nylon surface on the idler. Now we're going to have a talk about different tubes. The two tubes that we offer right now is a standard and an HD tube. The difference is HD is going to have more ribs. It's not going to deflect or bend as easily, but it's also 2 inches as opposed to the standard tube, which is only 1 3/4 inches. You can see the difference. The standard tube goes up to 8 feet before we see major deflection, and the HD tube, we span from that 8 foot to 10 foot. Make sure when you're using an HD tube that everything on that wall or line of sight is all on an HD tube. That way, when the tubes are all rolled up, they all look the same. If you were to have two different tubes, when these things roll up, they'll roll up at different speeds. Before using any saw, I definitely recommend some form of ear protection. Cutting aluminum is extremely loud, and obviously let's save those eyes. Z87 or better. There's just no excuse for not wearing safety glasses. We've got a Evolution, the Saw by Rage. These are bought on Amazon for about 160 bucks. It cuts through aluminum like butter. I would not use this saw on steel, but aluminum and wood all day long. Plus it's got a clamp. That's probably one of the best parts about this design, is that I'm able to hands-freely put my tube in, make all my measurements, and then readjust. Just one thing to be wary of is obviously be careful for anything in here, and if your hand's on the trigger, that's when it's dangerous. If you're trying to make your measurement, nothing's going to happen with your hand off the trigger. When you're locating the right spot to cut, sometimes it can be in the house with the floor coverings on. You want to just make sure that all of your scrap gets cleaned up. Aluminum's not going to hurt anything, but still, you want to be as clean as possible. Typically, I cut in the garage or out near a tree somewhere. Pulling our first measurement, it's going to be shade number 1. I'm calling this the kitchen. And our measurement is cut at 30 1/4 of an inch, which is right here. So I'm going to make a line at 30 1/4 of an inch. Now I want to save all of this tube is going to go hopefully in the window, and all of this is going to go back into my scrap bin. So I'm going to make a mark on this side and put an X on it. That mark says I want to cut on this side, and the X is scrap. Now we can take the vise off. Come over to the saw once again. I can't stress this enough. Hand off the trigger. I just want to get the saw blade, that tooth, right on the edge of my line. So it looks like that's going to be our 30 1/4. I'm going to dial it back in, and before I make my cut, this is my second measurement. And it looks like I'm pretty good on 30 1/4. And my saw blade is on the scrap side, so I'm going to go ahead and make this cut. After the cut, just knock out any of that loose debris that's sitting inside there. You don't want that going back into the house with you. Take a file to knock off any burrs. That one's good. Let's try the other side. A little bit there. That side is good as well. Well, looks like I might be a little long. Let's take a half a saw blade out here. There we are, 30 1/4. Now the label. I label every single tube because they're all roughly the same size. I like to cut everything at once so that we're not making continuous trips to a saw. And this one is kitchen number 1, and it is the idle side, and the cut was at 30 1/4. All right, let's go fit it. Now that we've cut all our tubes, it's time to insert our motors and idlers. The idler can really only go in one way. The way that it goes in is that these ribs line up with these ribs. So that way there's no play. If it goes in wrong, it A, won't line up with the tube next to it, and it can move, and this will just make wacky noises. So make sure that when you're inserting your idlers that you're putting the ribs inside of the ribs. The way that the idlers work is you fit one end and then you draw the idler in, spin it counterclockwise, and it'll lock in place. To release, it'll shoot out with the spring. When you're dealing with a coupler, ladies first, female goes in one end, and then the male, and that's how I'm getting the motor to spin multiple shades. The other way you can use the coupler is a female with an isolator gear and then a pin idler. All of this comes inside the box with the coupler. So female still goes up against the Delrin, but the pin idler will give you independent control of that shade. So say you had a door or you just wanted to have another motor for power. You could have independent control of these two shades. When installing the motor, there's only one way that the drive can go in, and then you've got a crown that goes over top of what I like to call the tooth knockout, and then the two flats go in the two flats, and all of the ribs will line up. You always want to install the motor first. With all of the wires tucked towards the back, wiggle it into a pinhole. Once you get it in, you can set it counterclockwise and then release. Pressing it firmly up against, and now we can install the idler. So here we go. That side's in, counterclockwise, and there we go. So you can see, coupled, both spin together. You can also see that I have a little bit of wiggle here, and that little bit of wiggle is what I'm calling the safety, or the credit card. The Geiger template will suffice to check to make sure that you're getting all the way down to the nylon. The reason for this, and it's one of the most important things across the board with the Geiger installation, is if these bind at all, it could retract your idler, and then that shade's just going to fall out. That being said, obviously nobody wants that. So allowing for that little bit of space, that's going to ensure that it never falls out of the ceiling. When we go to put fabric on this later, I'll show you what could happen. Before starting the tube installation, just a couple of things to think about. Inspect your tube prior to cutting. It's just going to save you hassle in the end. Any dings or bent tubes or compromised ends, say this isn't perfectly round, is really going to give you a bad install. So discard any of that. We'll talk to FedEx. We'll give you some new tube. It is what it is. Another thing to think about is you don't want to overuse the idlers. So taking them out, putting them back in, taking them out, putting them back in, it's going to compromise the idler, and it could make a clicking noise. We all know that with an exposed shade, any noise is bad noise. So try to leave those in as long as you can. If you have a long tube, say anything over 5 feet, where it's going to be difficult for you to get from one end to the other, you might want to make sure that you have 2 installers on that job, just so one guy can fit the motor and the other guy can click out the tube. It's just going to make it that much easier for everybody. Something serious to think about with the motor, when you put it in, it's not secure in there. So if you flip the tube over and don't have a secure handle on the motor could just fly right out, and on a ladder, that could do some damage to a floor. When you're done with the first part of the install, and you've gone around and checked every single tube with a credit card or the Geiger template, and you know that it's perfect, you go ahead and place your order. That tube size is what you're ordering for width, and then the drop is obviously going to be from the top of the jam to the bottom of the jam. That being said, leave the tube up. The only reason I would remove the tube is, say the builder had a touch-up paint or something like that. You probably don't want too much paint on the tube, but leave the tube up. And if anybody has a concern with that, tell them I like to leave it up so it doesn't get compromised. That tube is the tube that you're using for the fabric.